Hello and welcome to our discussion of the Reform Movement and the rebellions of 1837-1838. This is a fairly broad-ranging story. We're going to cover a fair bit of terrain here today, but this is really kind of the active political and then non-political, actually violent attempts to improve the democratic character of Upper and Lower Canada in this time period. There are similar movements underway in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and PEI for that matter, though they do not result in armed rebellion, and so we're not going to be looking at them today. But I will say really, really quickly that certainly the political movement that we're seeing in Upper Canada is mirrored in the maritime colonies as well. This is interesting because a lot of Canadians point to the more exciting nature of of American history, and particularly the American Revolution as a kind of founding moment where Americans kind of know what they're all about because they were in that moment united together and had a common idea. I think that's overplaying the common idea. Certainly, most histories of the American Revolution show increased support over time for the revolutionary goals of the American rebellion, the Revolution. But that was comparable in Canada too, and it gets suppressed more quickly in Canada, and it certainly didn't have as much support as the American one did. But it's comparable, and it's entirely possible that with a few more early successes, they too would have built greater popular support within the population. And so this may well have been Canada's revolutionary moment. It isn't, it didn't happen. And so this is 30 years before Confederation. So in some ways, we're kind of heading towards Confederation here because people are going to look for alternative political means to achieve these ends. Even though politics has already failed, they're going to certainly look for ways to create accommodations that weren't on the table prior to 1837. So we're going to look at a reform movement, we're going to look at a political reform movement, and we're going to look at its outcomes here today. Loosely, we're going to look at the broad politics of this, the call for responsible government, as they called it. And I'll explain what that is in a minute. But really, really loosely, we're looking at increased democratization, and more particularly about the decentralization of power, putting more power, more authority with lower levels of government and lower levels in society. In other words, giving more power to the people and less power to the elites. That's very, very loosely what the call for responsibility was about, but I'll show you exactly what it means here in a minute. We'll look at the end of politics. So there's a reform movement, a political reform movement that breaks down, not in 1837, it actually breaks down by probably 1834, 1835, but in the next 2 years is where the kind of escalation towards rebellion will take place. So we'll look at the actual rebellion in 1837 and 1838, and then we'll look at some of the outcomes of this. And I'm pointing here in the outline to the Durham Report and the Tory riots, the conservative riots of 1849. It's quite a bit later, obviously, but it's directly linked to what's happening in the rebellions. So they're looking for a responsible government. What is responsible government? Well, we saw, and we talked about a bit last week when we were looking at the Loyalists, we saw that power, they were certainly given an assembly, and we see the structure here, the governor, the council, and the assembly. And they were given an elected assembly. But what we also saw was that compared to the older American, now United States, now the states of the United States, no longer the colonies of Britain, the legislative assemblies that were created in Canada were much more centralized. They had far fewer powers than the older New England and Virginia models had. And so what they're doing is they're vesting more power, more responsibility with the Legislative Council. And of course, that's an appointed body, not an elected body. And then of course, there's also the power of veto and also the power to initiate some bills by the governor himself. So these are, in the case of the governor, a British colonialist, often a military figure. And in the Legislative Council, usually represents the elite of the colony, the richest people in the colony, the most powerful politically in the colony, certainly some religious leaders, bishops, Anglican bishops in particular, in Quebec, Catholic bishops find themselves in the Legislative Council. And so what you see is this kind of really tight group, and we talked about the family compact, and in Quebec they call them the Chateau Clique. This small group of people who hold a disproportionate amount of power in these colonies. And they have an assembly, which is the popular assembly, the elected assembly. But the elected assembly often, and increasingly so, finds itself at odds with the appointed bodies above it, and unable to affect, as they point out repeatedly, unable to affect the will of the people. So what the people want to have done in their elected bodies isn't getting done because it's being blocked by this council. So why responsible government? Well, the issue is who in these different levels is responsible to whom. So if you look at the governor, how does the governor get his position? And it is safe to say he in this case, because it's always a he. How does he get his position? Well, he's appointed by the Colonial Office. So who is he responsible to? He's responsible to the Colonial Office. Simple as that. In other words, responsibility is flowing up, and the people don't play a role there. And then there's the Legislative Council. Well, how do the people on the Legislative Council get their positions? Well, they're appointed by the governor. So who are they responsible to? They're responsible to the governor. The Legislative Assembly, how do those people get their power? Well, that's clear enough. They get elected by the people. And so who are they responsible to? They're responsible to the people. In other words, within the structure, it's only the assembly that are responsible to the people. And so in seeking responsible government, they want to change the system. The reformers want to change the system so that that middle body, the Legislative Council, will be chosen not at the whim of the governor, but will be chosen from the Legislative Assembly. In other words, they will choose the council from the elected body. And if that sounds kind of familiar to you, it should. That's really the way our government works today, except we don't call it the Legislative Council, we call it the cabinet. We call the Prime Minister, in the federal level, we talk about the Prime Minister and his cabinet. At the provincial level, we talk about the Premier and her cabinet. So the people that occupy those executive positions and the Legislative Council positions should be chosen by the Assembly. And that's what the reformers are seeking here, because they argue that that will make the government responsible to the people. Not to the governor, not to the British state, but to the people. Now obviously the governor would still be there and he could still block legislation, so there'd still be some responsibility to the British. But it would be better. It would certainly be an improvement, and you would have a more democratic government. What they point out continuously is that power flows up in this, and it can be stopped at every step along the way. So if the Legislative Assembly votes on a bill, it then goes to the Legislative Council for approval. And if the elite doesn't like what the people are doing, well, the elite will veto that bill. And if the governor finds that the council has done something that he doesn't think the British state will want them to do, he'll veto it. So it's very difficult for the popular will, the ordinary people's voice, to get through in all of this. And so they're looking for ways to enhance the democratization, the democracy rather, of these colonies. Saw this before, the Family Compact. They represent this kind of elite group, military officials, colonial officials, wealthy merchants, church officials, church bishops. Bishop Strachan is here. Lots of them have loyalist backgrounds, and certainly that kind of conservative Tory elite background is part of the story. And really, in many ways, this becomes a struggle between a kind of democratic vision by the liberal reformers and an older, much more conservative and much more hierarchical vision as represented by the Tories, by the Conservatives in this time. And I've got the figures here for Upper Canada, but we could have comparable figures in Lower Canada, and as I show you here at the bottom of the screen, there's also comparable figures here for New Brunswick and Nova Scotia as well. These established figures who represent British interests. Really, that's what they're all about, is representing British interests and trying to maintain that British way. Remember John Graves, last week we talked about John Graves Simcoe and seeking a truly British colony. Well, that's part of this as well. Last week we also talked about kind of the role of Protestantism and the established churches in particular. And certainly you can see Bishop John Strahan's role here as well. So there's all kinds of privileges go to the elite. And you can see that this deck is really stacked in their favor in all kinds of ways. I mean, obviously they're rich and they're powerful, but because they're rich and they're powerful and because the colony is just developing, they're creating institutions, and they're creating new institutions that really serve their own interests better than anybody else's. So this is in a time period before public schools, and we'll talk about the creation of schools in a week or two. But right now, public schools don't exist, and we're seeing private schools created like Upper Canada College. Upper Canada College exists to teach the children of the elite. It's not a public school, although it does get state funding. It's not a public school, it's a private school, And it's really meant to serve that kind of older, hierarchical, conservative vision. And really, that's the education that they offer there as well. It's one that's strongly imbued with that kind of British sense of principles that emphasize hierarchy, emphasize order, emphasize stability. And while not undemocratic, certainly are not Republicans, certainly are not kind of bottom-up Democrats. They're kind of conservative Democrats. All kinds of privileges offered to many people. So one of the ones that becomes a big issue in the 1820s and 30s and 40s are the clergy reserves. 1/7 of all the land in Upper Canada is reserved for the clergy. And by that, they don't mean that they're going to give land to priests or ministers or whatever. It means that it's land that's available to the church to be sold, often to build a church on, but also to be sold. And for that way, it's a fundraising mechanism for the church. And of course, what people point out fairly quickly is that 1/7 of the land is a lot of land. It's worth a lot of money. And if the church doesn't quickly move that land onto the market, it's actually blocking development. And so you get this kind of pattern as you see on this map drawn from the 1830s. This is the township of Newtown, and you can see all these black bits marked off here. And what it means is that those lots of land, big chunks of land, are not being developed. And so what people who are trying to improve these communities, build these communities, develop these communities are seeing is the church, and therefore the privileged elite are blocking development in many ways. And, you know, if it's one thing to see an empty lot and be annoyed by it, but it's also if you have children and those children are coming of age and they're looking for land and there's land right there, but you can't access it because it belongs to the church, then that becomes a frustration. So you see this kind of criticism of the clergy reserves becoming a pretty important popular issue in the 1820s and 1830s. You also see how the public purse is getting spent. Lots of complaints that money is being spent on large imperial projects, projects that aren't necessarily about opening up trade, opening up the interior, getting the economy of the new colony going, but of serving imperial interests. And a good example of this is the Rideau Canal, which is built in the 1820s and 1830s. It's designed to channel troops back and forth across from Lower Canada to Upper Canada. It's really designed to be an insulated waterway away from the St. Lawrence River that they can move troops on and move troops effectively should an American invasion take place. And that's good. And you can think, well, that's a fine thing. That we probably should have those kinds of defenses. But it's costing a fortune. Look at this. Look at this sum, £822,000 in the 1820s. That's a lot of money. We're talking billions of dollars today. Very, very expensive project. And so there's two concerns here. One is that the money is being spent on these imperial projects rather than projects to encourage development in the communities. And two, who's getting the contracts to build all these things? Again, it's that privileged elite, the wealthy contractors, the wealthy merchants. It's these people who are making money off of this. And of course, this is public money. This is money that's taxes raised by local people. And so they're angry about this. And they're saying, we are paying costs, paying taxes that support this privileged elite. And this is just simply wrong. And so again, this is another issue of popular discontent at the time, that if the people had a more responsible government, they would be able to better protect the purse, the public purse. Of course, we have another example right around here in the case of the Welland Canal. This is St. Catharines in an illustration from about 1850. Lovely. I love this illustration. It's really quite lovely. Unfortunately, I'm blocking a little scene of a boat going through the locks from you, but it's still quite a lovely image of St. Catharines down by the waterfront. This is roughly where the bridge is downtown. This is different in that it's not one of those imperial projects. It is about opening up the internal trade of the region, but it's also getting money from taxes, and it's also being designed with an eye to military considerations as much as trade considerations, and it's also channeling public money into private hands. And so again, concerns about corruption and privilege going to these wealthier figures. So in Upper Canada, in Ontario, it's mostly about Upper Canada, and it's mostly about kind of the privileges that that this wealthy elite gets. So in many ways, it's political, but it's also kind of a class issue as well. It's about the rich versus the poor, the elite versus the ordinary people, that kind of story. It's exactly the same in Lower Canada, except that in Lower Canada, there's a nationalistic dimension added to this, which is to say that not only is there an elite question, not only is there a political question, in other words, not only is it exactly the same as it is in Ontario or in Upper Canada, but that most of that elite is English and most of the people are French. Now there are certainly French members of the elite, and certainly the Catholic bishops show up on the Legislative Council in Quebec rather. Certainly there's some rich French Canadians. We'll see one in a few minutes. But generally speaking, the vast majority of the population in Lower Canada is A, French, B, Catholic, and C, fairly poor. Not poor, poor's the wrong word, but not rich by any stretch of the imagination. They're the ordinary farmers, they're ordinary settlers, the only ordinary workers in the towns and so on. And so this becomes a nationalistic issue in Lower Canada as well. And I think that's probably the key feature that explains why the movement draws much more popular support in Lower Canada than it does in Upper Canada. It's that nationalistic dimension. And if you think about it, it makes it a more visceral, it makes it a more less intellectual, more heartfelt kind of response. And I think generally people are mobilized to those kinds of politics more effectively. Certainly that's a truism in other historical moments, other moments of rebellion as well. So certainly broadly similar politics going on in Upper and Lower Canada, both featuring groups seeking to reform the government, though one with a more nationalistic lens than the other, with Quebec having a more nationalistic lens than Ontario, Lower Canada than Upper Canada. Newspapers play a really important role in the story. I'll just mention really quickly, this is Joseph Howe in Nova Scotia, William Lyon Mackenzie here in Upper Canada, Luger Duvenet in Lower Canada, Quebec. And these are people who keep this issue alive continually in their newspapers, draw attention to the abuses that this privileged elite is allowed to engage in. And is there some hyperbole in this? Oh, no doubt. But they do draw attention to a kind of pattern where the elite is clearly able to affect their will much more easily than the people are. And every time, not every time, there's hyperbole right there, but most often when the reformers are trying to seek legislative initiatives or monies to be spent that might be more in tune with popular sentiment, it often gets thwarted by those higher levels of government, by the elites. And so the newspapers draw attention to those issues consistently. And while Joseph Howe never leads a rebellion, William Lyon Mackenzie will. And if you read their columns, Mackenzie's probably more strident than Howe, but the same basic issues. They're certainly talking about similar issues, and they're looking for similar outcomes along the way. So in all of this, as this is happening, the Assembly has some advantages. So I'm talking about how legislation moves up through the House and how therefore the Council and then the Governor can block everything. But the Assembly has some advantages as well. So the first thing that you can point to is the exclusive right to initiate money bills. What that means is that if the government is going to spend money, in other words, if they're going to take a pot of money and spend it on something, on a road, a bridge, a canal, whatever, it cannot be initiated by the Council. It cannot be initiated by the Governor. It has to be initiated by the Assembly. And that makes perfect sense, of course, because it's their money. They're the people who are formally raising this money. So that's really, really important. And what that means is that it gives leverage to the Assembly, and they can sometimes force negotiations. So they can often get what they want by saying, well, we're not going to, there's that important money bill, hypothetically, on that canal or whatever. They can say, if you want that money for that canal, we want this piece of legislation passed as well. So they can get engaged in kind of horse trading that way, which can be used to their advantage, and does work often to their advantage. The other issue, though, is that Britain itself is undergoing a reform movement. In 1832, right at the height of the discussion here, the Great Reform Bill is passed. The Great Reform Bill expands the democratic franchise in Great Britain dramatically. In 1830, there's only a couple thousand people can vote in Great Britain. It's heavily property-based, and the standard for how much property you need to own is very, very high. That changes dramatically in 1832. Thousands and thousands and thousands of additional people, often ordinary people, small property holding people, not working class people, not propertyless people, but thousands of more people are brought into democracy by an expanded franchise, by an expanded vote. And so that's really, really significant, because here in the colonies, and we talked about this in our loyalism discussion, when the reformers brought up democratization, one of the, not the only reply, but one of the replies of the conservatives was always, that's not British. We are Britons, and that's not a British system. That's an American system. We don't do that kind of thing. But this allowed the reformers to say, hey, this is British. The British are engaging in the exact same kind of reforms that we're engaging in. You cannot say that this is not a British model. This is a British model. The conservatives still said, yeah, but we're a young colony and things are different here. And certainly this debate goes on in some measure. But it did give the reformers a bit of a momentum boost. It allowed them to walk a higher road and to say, we are engaged in a process that our mother country is itself engaged in. So we too are engaged in a British activity. So that was really an effective change for them. Loose summary of what happened, and this is really loose. Your textbook is pretty good on this. It's beginning in the 1820s, but 1830s you see protests, tensions increasing. Massive cholera outbreak, particularly in Montreal in 1832, followed by some crop failures. You see some significant destitution, not people starving to death, but certainly people in starvation-like circumstances. So we're talking about the serious crop failures here. There's an election in 1832 in Lower Canada. The troops fire into a crowd, kill 3 people in Montreal. And much of this is a kind of period of tremendous volatility, tremendous political uncertainty. Long story, but really to cut this short, in 1834, thwarted yet again by the conservative elite, the Patriot, the party of the patriots, the rebels, the reformers in Lower Canada, refused to vote the money supply. So remember, they have the capacity to initiate money bills, and they're refusing to do this in 1834. And also in 1834, they pass a series of resolutions. They call them the 92 resolutions. Probably shouldn't have had so many. It makes things kind of confusing. They probably should have a nice list of 10 or something like that. But they sent off 92 complaints, resolutions, the positions of the people in February of 1834. This is what we want. And they're using the money supply issue as leverage to try to get what they want. It doesn't work. What the governor does is simply suspend the Legislative Assembly and suspends the Assembly's requirement to initiate money bills. And so he passes his own money bill. He just bypasses them. Constitutionally pretty dodgy, but it's the colonies. The British government's going to let him get away with it, and they do. The resolutions go off to Britain in February of 1834, where nothing happens. And you think, well, that's an exciting story, but that's kind of the point. The British just sit on them. They really don't act on them at all, because from their perspective, they've seen this before. Remember, this is how the American Revolution got started. And how did they try to deal with the American Revolution? They tried to accommodate, they tried to negotiate, and it failed. So they're going to be firm here. This is their response here in Canada in the 1830s. It takes 3 years, but the British Parliament rejects the 92 resolutions. And they don't just reject most of the 92 resolutions, or many of the 92 resolutions. They reject all the 92 resolutions. This is a slap in the face. Reform is not happening the way you want reform to happen, this message sends. So when this gets communicated back to Canada in May of 1837, they also send along new instructions for the governor. including new rules that allow the governor to raise money himself, just completely bypass. So now it is constitutionally valid because the British Colonial Office has said it is, allowing the governor to just spend money as he sees fit. And just to kind of rub some salt in the wounds, it also announces the creation of a new land grant, 5 million acres, big chunk of land, to a land company, the British American Land Company. And the name of this is interesting too. It's very clearly, well, it's a British company obviously, but it's very clearly an American and an English company as well, an English language company. And what French Canadians see in this is yet another attempt by the British to kind of assimilate the French Canadians by sending in more British settlers, American settlers. They want to flood French Canada with English speakers, with Protestants, and they see this land company as another attempt to do this. So these two actions really stir additional anger. There was already lots of anger, but this really becomes a kind of final moment when they say, clearly, the British government is not going to negotiate with us. We have engaged in a long political process to try to reform the system, and it has failed. We've been doing this for years, and it's failing. We need to do something more dramatic. Summer of 1837, organization of opposition becomes much more clear, much more effective. This is Louis-Joseph Papineau addressing the people. This is a later painting. This is from the 1880s, I think. So it's not a contemporary painting, but it shows Papineau addressing the crowd at Six Counties in the summer of 1837, rallying the people to the reform cause, but also rallying popular support for the cause to be taken to a new level. Because they're also, not only are they giving speeches saying we need to support these political positions, they're also beginning to train a patriot militia. In other words, a rebel militia unit, not unit, army, an entire army. French Canadian people, Lower Canadian people, Upper Canadian people, lots of them have guns, lots of them have shotguns, but not that many. Not particularly good weapons, and they certainly don't have military training. But during the summer of 1837, in Lower and Upper Canada, people with military training are bringing people out into farm fields and training them to march, training them to follow orders, training them to shoot regularly, training them to act like soldiers, because they see armed rebellion coming. Also in the summer and fall of 1837, you see kind of popular mobilizations across the colony. One of these is an English response to this on part of British settlers in Lower Canada, and there's lots of them. And again, they tend to be the elite, but not all of them. And they form a society, actually, I shouldn't say they, a group of them form a society in 1837. They call themselves the Doric Society. It's mostly young men, 18 to 25, 26, 27, that kind of range. Many of them are children of the elite. Many of them are educated. Many of them are angry that this kind of popular French Catholic group is mobilizing around them, trying to change the society from which they benefit. And so they engage in kind of popular protests in Montreal during the late summer and early fall of 1837. In response to this, a group of young French-Canadian men called the Filles de la Liberté, the Sons of Liberty. And of course, think about that. Where did that name come from? That name comes, of course, from the American Revolution. The rebels there are called the Sons of Liberty. So they're picking up on that American theme. This group forms as a counter to the Doric Society. And in October of 1837, in the streets of Montreal, there are several battles would be the wrong word, but certainly sometimes armed confrontations, usually bricks and bottles, not guns, but certainly armed confrontations between these groups. We have riots in the streets. Hundreds of people engaged in pitched battles for control of the streets along political principles, and also, ironically too, along ethnic lines as well. Now, this is not happening in Upper Canada, rather. It's not happening in Ontario. The political debate is going on, but it's not kind of forming into mobilization on the streets, and it's certainly not mobilizing around ethnic lines. But this is certainly what's happening in Lower Canada. The Lower Canadian Reformers also call a constitutional convention. And again, you think, well, where did they get that idea? It's from the American Revolution. And so they're not just imitating them. They're saying, we find common cause with these Republican ideals from the Republic to the South. And we to imagine ourselves to be Democrats, to be Republicans, to be supporters of the popular will, And the Constitutional Convention will be this moment when we get together in December of 1837 to draw up our new Constitution. And again, that's exactly what had happened in the United States 60 years earlier, 50 years earlier. It doesn't happen. In November of 1837, the British impose martial law as a response to all of this, although other people would say not so much as a response to this, as a way to kind of agitate the situation, but we can talk about that some other time. They impose martial law, which suddenly means all democratic channels of government are suspended. The rules of habeas corpus, in other words, what the police must do with you if they arrest you. Normally, under the terms of habeas corpus, you need to have a charge issued within 24 hours. Under martial law, that gets suspended. They can just start jailing people because they view them as suspicious. Martial law is imposed in November of 1837, and it's clear that a rebellion is either underway or about to be underway. And in fact, it is. Within weeks, battles break out in Lower Canada, and then a few weeks later in Upper Canada, with the rebels taking on British troops. Now, I'm going to move off of this slide really, really quickly, but I'll mention some of the place names along the way in the next few minutes, and you'll see some of them are on this map. You'll see Saint-Denis and Saint-Charles. There's the island of Montreal. There's Chateauguay. Remember, we saw Chateauguay in the Battle of Chateauguay in the War of 1812, but not relevant today. And then just west of Montreal there, you can see Saint-Eustache. And Saint-Eustache is significant because that'll be the last major battle of the failed rebellions. The rebels start off well. They have a victory in Saint-Denis on the 22nd of November, 1837. And this is an illustration from a British book newspaper published about 2 or 3 weeks later. This person wasn't there, and the way they kind of imagine the battle is interesting. They certainly show a regular marching, disciplined French-Canadian militia unit marching towards what appears to be a disorganized British military unit. And certainly they won the day that day, and this discipline might explain that, but that's not really how the battle happened. And actually the French-Canadian militia units, and for that matter the ones in Upper Canada as well, tended not to engage in these kinds of open field kinds of battles because they knew that it would be at a disadvantage there. They tried to engage in kind of more guerrilla style warfare. They knew that against trained British soldiers they would probably lose those kinds of open battlefield kinds of battles, so why bother? The British marched troops up the river 2 days later to attack another village, and this is really kind of the end of the Patriots' successes in the fall of 1837. The British capture Saint-Charles-sur-Richelieu 2 days later. And this battle probably better illustrates the kind of warfare we're talking about. This is in farmland along a river, and what you're seeing are, you can see dead center in the painting that you guys are looking at right now. There's a kind of red troops lined up against what appears to be flames coming out of a building, but that's meant to illustrate gunfire. And that's what was kind of going on here. There were attempts by the Patriot Army to use buildings and the landscape and fences and stone walls and so on as kind of defensive measures to try to have an advantage because they knew this terrain better than the British did. But it doesn't matter. But this time the British are much better prepared than they were the previous time. You can see in the center of this they have cannons, and they defeat the Patriot Army fairly quickly. And 2 weeks later, they're engaged in more or less mop-up operations. At Saint-Eustache, 2 weeks after Saint-Charles, the British troops marched on the village and effectively end the rebellion in a decisive defeat of the Patriot Army. Again, this is one of these paintings, we see lots of them in this course where lots of things, multiple scenes are going on at the same time. But you can see there's a major battle outside the town, that's in the foreground here. You see British troops marching over the fence, that happens later in the day. And then they lay siege to the village itself, and you can see men jumping out of the burning church there in the center, which really reflects kind of the end of the battle. Saint-Eustache is burned to the ground. Saint-Charles-sur-Richelieu had been burned to the ground a few weeks earlier. The British are engaged in an absolute search and destroy kind of approach here. They're just burning everything in their path. Anybody that has the faintest hint of perhaps supporting the rebels is being arrested and their farms and properties are being destroyed. This is the final attempt to suppress any kind of armed rebellion. Much of the leadership is arrested in the coming weeks. 17 of them are executed. They spend the winter in prison, awaiting trial. Some of them are exiled. Total of several hundred are arrested across the colony. And the following year, the rebellion will break out again, but it will not be effectively organized, and it will not have a particularly significant story to be told. Really, this fall of 1837 is the major story to be, is the major dimension of the rebellion. So who are these people? And this is really when it begins to get really interesting. Let's look at who these people were. First group of people we can point to are the people themselves, the patriots. The vast majority of them are ordinary farmers. And this illustration, this is a great illustration. This is the only in-place, we have no photographs obviously, but this is the only on-the-scene illustration of the people who were rebelling in 1837. This is by a young woman, Jane Ellis, who's the daughter of a wealthy, significant political figure in the eastern townships of Quebec. And their house and their properties are occupied by a Patriot army in the summer of 1838. And she draws the men who are outside the house in this illustration. And it's a motley crew. They're farmers. They're very, very ordinary people. You can see by their dress, their simple kind of French-style peasant dress. But what's most particular is their weaponry. How many guns do you see? 2. There's 2 guns in this picture. The rest of them are pikes. Farmers, untrained military farmers with pikes are not going to defeat regular British soldiers with guns and cannons. This is just not going to happen. But this gives us a really good sense of who these people were. But I think it also gives us a good sense of what they were prepared to sacrifice. These are poor people. They're giving up, they're risking everything here. Well, their lives, obviously, but they're risking everything, their properties, everything that they have in the world. So their commitment to this is clear and strong. The other group we can point to, and this is interesting, because we think of it as a popular rebellion, and we think of it as against the elite. But one of the most important leaders of the Lower Canadian Rebellion is this guy, Louis-Joseph Papineau, and this is his wife, Julie. Papineau's rich. This portrait of him is one of 8 I could have chosen to show you. This is one of the richest men in Lower Canada. He's very conservative, although he has a liberal streak, and we can talk about that some other time. But he's a passionate nationalist, and it's really the nationalism more than the liberalism that's driving him here. He's liberal enough, but he's also an owner of an old seigneur. In other words, he has several dozen men working under him as tenant farmers in the estates that he owns in Lower Canada. He also invests in early industrial activities in Lower Canada. This is a rich man, a man who lives very, very well in Lower Canada. And these paintings illustrate that really quite nicely. He lives in a different world than that last group we saw. These are the elite figures who exist in Lower Canada who are leading the rebellion from the French Canadian side. But it's really important to keep in mind people like this. There is English participation on the Lower Canadian side. Not much, it's mostly French Canadians, but certainly men like Wolfred Nelson. Wolfred Nelson is Papineau's principal lieutenant. He's the military commander in the field, and he's English. Well, he's British. He is a liberal reformer, and he is not particularly concerned by the nationalist issue. He's mostly concerned for the liberal politics of this. He wants to see enhanced democratization. So they're certainly seeing common cause here. And I guess looking at these people, you can see people who, in many ways, who have quite different interests, but people who are now finding common cause. And ironically, also finding common cause with the people in Upper Canada as well, the rebels in Upper Canada as well. Speaking of those people, the Upper Canadian Rebellion is a less dynamic story. There's more battles, but they're less significant, less chances of success. They're crushed more readily. But we can quickly look at the leadership of William Lyon Mackenzie. Mackenzie is the rebel leader, the newspaperman. But we can also point to Robert Baldwin as kind of the other side of the reform movement. These two men represent two approaches to reform. Mackenzie is the rebel. He's the guy who's willing to take up arms to overthrow the British government. Baldwin's not. They both want the same end. They both want the same democratic reforms, but Baldwin's not willing to go the revolutionary route. He wants to continue the reformist political route. And this will really mark these two men as different in this story. The battles are less famous in Upper Canada. This is the most famous one, the March from Montgomery's Tavern, which is roughly up around Eglinton Street in Toronto, marching south towards downtown. The Upper Canadian rebels, because the British pulled troops out of Toronto to go up the river back to Montreal to suppress rebellion there, the Upper Canadian rebels see this as an opportunity to capture Toronto, to capture the capital. And so they plan an assault. Don't plan assaults from taverns. It's not a good idea, and it doesn't work. They're defeated quickly and easily, almost comically in some ways. They were poorly trained. Probably some of them were drunk. It was not an effective armed response. There are additional battles fought in 1838 as well, but as in Lower Canada, the rebels are crushed fairly quickly and fairly easily. As in Lower Canada, there are executions in the spring and summer of 1838. More people actually are executed in Upper Canada. And again, the people who are executed represent a wide range of people, from some ordinary farmers to some fairly elite figures. I study agricultural reformers when I'm not teaching courses like this. And the president of the Upper Canadian Agricultural Society, a fairly elite guy, he's one of the people executed. You kind of think he might be siding with the Tories, but he's not. So you see a kind of range of interesting people here in the Upper Canadian side of the story as well. These are the flags. These might have been Canadian flags had the rebels won. The Upper Canadian flag of liberty, clearly kind of an American model there. And then the kind of French Canadian version down below that, which was an attempt to kind of, you can see there's elements of an Irish flag there as well. So they're trying to draw on kind of different dimensions, different politics to have a flag that would kind of unite them there. So what comes out of this? Well, lots of things come out of this, but by far the most important thing is the Durham Report. John George Lambton, Lord Durham, rising star in the British Parliament. At this point he is, I should have looked this up, not very old. He's about 42, I think, or something like that. And he's a rising star in British politics. People are seeing him as prime ministerial material. And he gets sent off to Canada to investigate what's going on. Which is interesting, just that they chose him, because he's a liberal. In his politics, in Great Britain, he aligns very, very closely with the reformers in the Canadian colonies. So it's surprising that the British would choose somebody who might be sympathetic to the rebels' concerns. But as we'll see, he both was and wasn't sympathetic to their concerns. And this is where you see an interesting divergent path begin to emerge in Canadian history, and I think a significant one as well. He writes a report on this. He goes to Nova Scotia, he goes to New Brunswick, he goes to Lower Canada, he goes to Upper Canada, he travels throughout all the colonies, spends vast majority of his time in Toronto, in Upper Canada, traveling around Upper Canada. Wasn't much to see in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick anyhow, because there's no rebellions there. But you'd think he might have stayed longer in Lower Canada, but he only stays, I should have looked this up, it's like 4 or 5 days. He doesn't stay long at all. But he stays weeks, months in Upper Canada. And this is where he comes to understand what he thinks happened and why it happened. So he writes this report, the Report on the Affairs of British North America, from the Earl of Durham, Her Majesty's High Commissioner, published in the summer of 1839. Huge report, very significant, not just for Canadian history, but also for Australian and New Zealand history, but British Commonwealth history in general, because he really outlines some of the principles of overseas government away from Britain. In other words, white colonial governments. So not the African colonies, not the Indian colonies, but the white settler colonies, where they're displacing indigenous people, how to create governments there, and what kind of principles they should operate on. This report outlines that and becomes very influential. in discussions of that crucial matter. It's a long report. It's over 1,000 pages long. And there's many recommendations, but the two most important ones by far, and the ones that have the most far-reaching effects, are these two. First one is, he saw in Canada the natural state of government in all these colonies is that of a collision between the executive and the representative body. In other words, between the council and the governor and the assembly. So between the executive bodies and the popular elected bodies. He sees there's a collision there all the time. In other words, he agrees with the reformers that the two are just butting heads all the time and they can't work together. And he looks for solutions to that. And the solution he recommends is a surprising one. He recommends responsible government. He says the way to deal with this is to choose the executive council, the legislative council, to choose it from the assembly. In other words, exactly what the reformers were asking for. So the British government looks at this and says, well, what do you think they'd say? They say no, because you can't reward the rebels. You can't give the rebels what they wanted. It's impossible. So they reject this out of hand. But it's interesting because here's this guy, and while he's a liberal and while he's sympathetic, he's still an imperial figure, and he still wants to keep the colonies in check. So it's remarkable that he made this recommendation. Less remarkable that they rejected it. The other key recommendation, so this applies to Upper and Lower Canada. So it doesn't get applied to either place, but he's thinking it should be applied to both of these. The second recommendation, though, has nothing to do with Upper Canada. It has to do with Lower Canada. And it's a really surprising recommendation, particularly given the little bit of time that he spent in Lower Canada, which suggests that he might have had a kind of prejudice operating here, that suggests that this is more kind of popular English views than it is an accurate assessment of what's going on the ground. His second recommendation is this. What I saw in the colonies was two nations warring in the bosom of a single state. And by nations, he means ethnic groups. And what he's really talking about there is the struggle between French Canadians and English Canadians in Lower Canada. Two nations warring in the bosom of a single state. He says that's the problem. And of course, this doesn't mean anything in Upper Canada because that situation doesn't exist in Upper Canada. It doesn't mean anything in Nova Scotia because that condition doesn't exist in Nova Scotia. It applies to Lower Canada and Lower Canada only. And so how does he see a solution here? What's his recommendation here? Unite the two Canadian colonies, Upper and Lower Canada, into one. Merge the two together. Make them one colony. He sees that as being a viable solution to all of this. Merge them just into one simple colony. And his strategy there is clear. The population of Upper Canada is growing, and if you combine it with the Lower Canadian population, which is not growing as fast, owing to immigration, lots of immigrants coming into Upper Canada, not going into Lower Canada. It's only natural increase there, biological increase taking place there. He knows that in 10, 20, 30 years at the most, the French Canadian population will be much smaller than the English Canadian population. In other words, they will be swamped by the English Canadians. And he sees this as a good long-term strategy, not a short-term strategy. This would have limited effect in the short term. In fact, in the short term, all it's going to do is anger French Canadians. But in the long term, he sees it as a way of effectively reducing certainly the power of French Canadians, but perhaps even eliminating them as a people. In other words, that they would eventually just kind of merge into the English Canadian population. So you would get rid of these two nations and become one nation. This is his imagined outcome for this. So what do you think the British state says to this? Absolutely, they like this idea. Because from their perspective, the problem isn't a political problem, it's a nationalistic problem. It's these French Catholics. Now, of course, that ignores completely what's going on in Lower Canada, in Upper Canada, where they had the exact same complaints, without the nationalistic dimension, but otherwise the exact same complaints. So this really turns it into an ethnic debate rather than a political debate, which from a British perspective is perfectly acceptable. It allows them to scapegoat one of the two groups and kind of let the other group off the hook. The expectation here is that the French Canadians and the English Canadians won't be able to get along. And often they don't. Often they don't. But there's also significant moments where they do, and the most famous of these is the coalition government between Robert Baldwin and Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine, two reform leaders. And certainly Durham assumed that the English Canadian reformers and the French Canadian reformers were so different that they wouldn't get along. He imagined that the lower Canadian reformers were really just nationalists, but they're not. They're liberal reformer nationalists, and they get along just fine with the liberal reformers. Not all the time, but often they do. And so the coalition that they form in the 1840s becomes a powerful statement of, we need political change. We need to reform our institutions. We need to democratize our institutions. And it's become a powerful call in Canada in the 1840s, uniting the voices of French and English Canadians. In a famous episode, Lafontaine and Baldwin swap ridings. Baldwin runs in a French riding in Lower Canada. Lafontaine runs in Baldwin's riding in Upper Canada. And they both win. And their message is really, it's a powerful message. We're not going to let nationalistic issues divide us. We're not going to let race and religion divide us. We are going to work together for democratic reforms. That's a very powerful message. In 1848 and 1849, the Reform government attempts to pass legislation. Legislation is called the Rebellion Losses Bill. It looks at complaints from farmers, business owners, various people across the colonies who lost property during the rebellions. Now, in some cases, they lost it because they were rebels and the army was attacking them. In other cases, the army was just kind of marching through and destroying things. Mixed stories there. But in 1848 to 1849, in an attempt to kind of reconcile the different peoples within these communities, the government decides to offer compensation to people whose property was destroyed during the rebellions, and not to assess their role in the rebellions, to simply say, your barn was burnt down, we'll give you 30 pounds for that. I'm making up numbers here, but it will compensate you in some kind of fashion like that. Conservatives are furious. They're absolutely furious about this. It angers them. They say, how can you give state rewards to people who rebelled against the state? And of course what the reformers say is, well, we're trying to find some reconciliation here, and many of these people did not rebel against the state, and it's really hard to tell the difference, so this is kind of an appropriate measure here. Now certainly in some ways there's a kind of wink-wink going on here. Certainly in some ways the reformers are helping their people more than the conservatives, and they certainly know that they're rubbing it in for the conservatives here a bit. But what's most significant here is that in 1849, the British Colonial Office sends new instructions to the governors of the Canadian colonies, instructing them not to overturn such legislation and to appoint new legislative councils and to draw those people from the assembly. So this bill, amongst other bills, but this contentious bill gets passed by the assembly. That's not surprising because the reformers dominate the assembly, but now they dominate the council as well. And the governor's instructions are clear from the British Colonial Office. His instructions are clear. Do not overturn this legislation. They've won. They now have responsible government. The council is now drawn from the assembly, and the governor is not going to interfere, at least not unduly. Later in history, we'll see governors interfering, but now a precedent has been established that he shouldn't be interfering. So there's a kind of, it's not confederation. Don't think that these are now independent countries, but a kind of autonomy, a kind of independence has certainly been established here. And this goes into effect in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, yes, and Lower and in Upper Canada. So the reformers have won. They've achieved their ends. Oh, that's those two issues. And the Tories are furious. And that night, the night that the governor does not veto the bill, Tories in Montreal riot and they burn the legislature. They burn it to the ground. And so it's a fitting moment of change to destroy the legislature of the colony, but at a moment when it's become democratized. When, indigenous people, women, African Americans will tell you it hasn't been fully democratized. People without any property will tell you it hasn't been fully democratized. But it's more democratized than it had been 10 years earlier. So there's a major success here, a significant expansion of the democratic tent in British North America.